Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. As you can see here today, I'm going to be talking about Plato's dialogue, The Laws, and I'm talking about Book 2. Now, for those of you who may have clicked on this video without having seen the video for Book 1, I will link that above. I do recommend watching that one first. Today, what we're focusing on is education and specifically music, and we're going to see how Plato ties them together. But first, let's take a look at what he means by education. All of the translations that I'm using throughout the laws come from Robert Gregg Bury. Okay, so here's what the Athenian Stranger says about education. I term then the goodness that first comes to children education. When pleasure and love and pain and hatred spring up rightly in the souls of those who are unable as yet to grasp a rational account, and when, after grasping the rational account, they consent thereunto through having been rightly trained in fitting practices, this consent, viewed as a whole, is goodness, while the part of it that is rightly trained in respect of pleasures and pains, so as to hate what ought to be hated right from the beginning up to the very end, and to love what ought to be loved, if you were to mark this part off in your definition and call it education, you would be giving it, in my opinion, its right name. So when we have a right opinion or right understanding, eventually, a right understanding and right knowledge about what is good and what is bad, that is virtue, that's goodness. But the education that allowed us to see why those right opinions that we had, perhaps had as children, are indeed correct, why we follow, so we follow wisdom, and the other virtues all follow wisdom. And that training is what he calls education. So very different from what we tend to mean by education when we talk about sending our kids off to grade school. Okay, now here's the next step. He says, the very gods who were given, as we said, to be our fellows in the dance, have granted the pleasurable perception of rhythm and harmony, whereby they cause us to move and lead our choirs, linking us one with another by means of songs and dances. And to the choir they've given its name from the chair implanted therein. Shall we accept this account to begin with, and postulate that education owes its origin to Apollo and the Muses? So there's a lot going on here. I'll start from the top here. This idea I'm going to come back to, the idea of the pleasurable perception of rhythm and harmony. Later in this book, he's going to talk about the idea of charm. And when I get to charm, I'll say more about this idea. But basically, just the idea that if we enjoy something, we're more likely to want to engage in that. And I'll come back to that more when I get to charm. And then you can see there's a play on words about choir and chair. The play doesn't really work, of course, in English, so I gave you the Greek there. And even those of you who don't read Greek, you can see that there are some characters in common in the two words, and so there's a play on words there. But the main thing is this last part, that education owes its origin to Apollo in the Muses. So I think most of you know that Apollo, among other things, is the god of music, and he's also the leader of the Muses. So here he's tying in education to music. Now you may recall from some of Plato's other dialogues that Socrates considered himself a follower of Apollo. Many philosophy students like to say that we're followers of Zeus because we think of Zeus as the leader of all of the gods, and so it must be the best one to follow. But Socrates says, no, he's not a follower of Zeus. He's a follower of Apollo. Well, what is so special about Apollo and about music in terms of philosophy? Well, anyone who's been watching my videos knows that I refer often to philosophy, to wisdom, to ignorance, all as states of mind. All of the virtues are states of mind. The very first video I put out in this series was on the virtues. And I tried to stress in that video that these are not behaviors, even though, of course, the state of mind will manifest as a behavior, and in our behavior, it'll manifest in our actions. But rightly speaking, when we're being specific here, the virtues are not behaviors, they're not actions. They are in our state of mind. They are themselves states of mind that manifest in a certain way. So, all of the infinite ways that ignorance can manifest, they're all states of mind. Wisdom is a state of mind, and as we deepen our knowledge and our wisdom, we also then have a deeper, more healthier state of mind. So it's all about states of mind. You can think of states of mind as an element of philosophy. I think you can also make a case that philosophy is an element of music, that it's all about states of mind or the study of states of mind. But ultimately, I think the two merge together in the idea of the philosopher king, who not only has developed wisdom, who has studied philosophy and perfected it to some degree, but manifests it in the world and acts from that place of wisdom. And so it's all about states of mind. And so that's what we're connecting together here. All right, what we have next to track down, like hounds on the trail, is goodness of posture and tunes in relation to song and dance. If this eludes our pursuit, it will be in vain for us to discourse further concerning right education, whether of Greeks or of barbarians. When we get to the end of Book 2, we're going to see that he ties the idea of posture and tune in with the idea of gymnastics, and it has a relation to music. We saw this somewhat in the Republic, where he was giving, of course, that analogy of the city-state to the soul. And so what he talked about on the surface was about politics and the city-state, but it always had its analog in the soul. And so the deeper meaning of gymnastics had to do with the building of energy that naturally comes as we are developing our state of mind. And as we're more fractured and our state of mind is pulling us in different directions, we're one way one day and another way another, sometimes minute to minute or hour to hour. We're more fractured, and so our energy is weaker. But as we get more unified, then we also find that our energy is stronger. And so there's an indelible connection between the idea of energy and state of mind. It's less obvious about gymnastics and music on the surface because, of course, athletic people aren't necessarily musical or vice versa. It's possible, but not necessary. So there isn't an obvious connection. But there is a connection at that deeper level. And so he always ties them together. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to say in the idea of Apollo, I'm going to go back for just a moment. Here he's talking here about rhythm and harmony. So Apollo, as the god of music, is also connected at the deeper level to the idea of that inner harmony and that inner unity in the soul. So connected to the idea of music with rhythm and harmony and that inner unity that we have. And so that's another reason why why Socrates saw himself as a follower of Apollo. And it connects in with this whole idea of music. Okay, going on now. To avoid a tediously long disquisition, let us sum up the whole matter by saying that the postures and tunes which attach to goodness of soul or body, or to some image thereof, are universally good, while those that attach to badness are exactly the reverse. I think straightforward there. Now, for those of you who may still be saying that, no, I'm reading too much into this, this is a dialogue about three old men taking a long walk, talking about government, planning a government, and they want to focus on choruses, singing to the public, and that's really all it is. Well, it's a strange way to read it, and it's an odd dialogue if that's really what Plato's doing. But if you think that's what he was doing here, he very directly says that these choric performances are representations of something at a deeper level, at the level of the soul. They're representations of character, exhibited in actions and circumstances of every kind, in which the several performers enact their parts by habit and imitative art, whenever the choric performances are congenial to them in point of diction, tune, or other features, whether from natural bent or from habit, or from both these causes combined. So our character, We saw this more in the Republic, but here he's bringing it in again, the idea that it's in our actions, it's exhibited in our actions and in our reactions to our circumstances. Some of it is from habit or from imitation of the adults who raised us. Some of it is our natural bent, because for Plato, remember, we're not blank slates when we're born. He does teach the idea of reincarnation, the idea that we bring with us our education and also our ignorance and what we need to learn in this lifetime comes with us in each lifetime, at the beginning of each lifetime, so we have a certain natural bent as well. So he asks, does the man who delights in bad postures and tunes suffer any damage thereby? In such a case it is, to be sure, inevitable that the person thus delighted becomes assimilated to those habits, good or bad, in which he delights, even though he is ashamed to praise them. So when we act a certain way, it does affect us. We can be influenced in a negative way by the people around us if we're running with the wrong crowd, so to speak. It does affect us. And I often think of this argument when I hear people say something mean and then try to dismiss it by saying, oh, I was just joking. We all have a sense of humor. We all delight in certain things, find pleasure in certain things, but what gives you pleasure says a lot about your character. And so that defense is not really as good of a defense as the person thinks, because what they're saying is that meanness is something that they take pleasure in. And so that says a lot about their character, and that's really what Plato's argument is here. I should regard that music which pleases the best people and the highly educated is about the best, and is quite the best if it pleases that one person who excels all others in virtue and education. So here he's driving the point home even more, so that we all have states of mind, but the states of mind and what he's calling here the music that pleases us, it says a lot about our character and about our level of wisdom. And so what pleases those who are wise, what he means here by best, the most virtuous and the highly educated in the way that he was talking about education earlier. So those who are educated in virtue and those who are wise. And so what brings them pleasure would be the best. And the person who excels all others in virtue and education, well, that person's state of mind must be the best of all. And we say that the judges of these matters need virtue for the reason that they need to possess not only wisdom in general, but especially courage. For the true judge should not take his verdicts from the diction of the audience, nor yield weakly to the uproar of the crowd or his own lack of education. Nor again, when he knows the truth, should he give his verdict carelessly through cowardice and lack of spirit, thus swearing falsely out of the same mouth with which he invoked heaven when he first took his seat as judge. For rightly speaking, the judge sits not as a pupil, but rather as a teacher of the spectators. So again, on the surface, he's talking about judges who judge these performances by choruses. If you take it just at that level, this is like, America's Got Talent judge. And that's obviously not what he's talking about. That kind of judge would not get this level of, or be treated with this level of importance by Plato, that you need wisdom, you need courage to be a judge. What he's really talking about here, of course, is the judge within us, the one who must follow truth, follow wisdom, even when it means going against the people around us, even when it means, going against what I want to say. I lost my train of thought there. Even when it means going against the grain and going against what is commonly considered among your friends and among those around you to be what is right. If wisdom is actually pointing you in a different direction, it takes courage, to go in that direction. Education is the process of drawing and guiding children towards that principle which is pronounced right by the law and confirmed as truly right by the experience of the oldest and the most just. So in order that the soul of the child may not become habituated to having pains and pleasures in contradiction to the law and to those who obey the law, but in conformity thereto, being pleased and pained at the same things as the old man. Here, the old man referring to, symbolizing the wise person. So we saw in Book 1 a definition of law as those pronouncements that the soul truly believes, of what it believes to be right or wrong. And of course, when we're young, before we're educated, some of those laws are wrong. And so we have to undo those false beliefs. But we saw before that we can't just talk ourselves out of them. It takes this certain kind of education to first go from belief to having right opinion, to pinning down that right opinion with understanding, and eventually getting some experience and knowledge that allows us to truly follow that law. And so we may have some right opinions within us. And before we can confirm them for ourselves, we may at least trust those who are wiser than us, those confirmed as truly right by the experience of the oldest and the most just, those wiser than us who we see as teachers. And so here we have another definition then of education, is that process of drawing us towards those principles of what is right. The good man, since he is temperate and just, is fortunate and happy, whether he be great or small, strong or weak, rich or poor. Whereas though he be richer even than Cinyras or Midas, if he be unjust, he is a wretched man and lives a miserable life. So here we're seeing this idea tying in wisdom and temperance and justice and so on to happiness. This was a main theme in the dialogue Epinomis, and I mentioned in that video that I did on that dialogue that this is a theme we're going to see throughout the laws as well. So here he's introducing it. Now I do want to just say as a side note that there is a social argument that's often a distortion of this, which I think needs to be addressed and eliminated. So the idea that if you're poor, you shouldn't complain about it. It's your state of mind is the problem. Just be happy. That is not at all what Plato's talking about here. Here, he's not talking about it at the social level, but at the level of the soul. And this has to do with that education of the soul. And the wise person will have a certain happiness about them, whether they are rich or poor. But that does not at all mean that we should not fight for a more equitable society. In fact, there's no reason that the person who reaches this kind of happiness that Plato's talking about here would not also fight for social justice. So the two things are not mutually exclusive. He's not saying here that if you have this happiness, you would not care about social equality. Of course you would still care. So that's a silly argument. It's a distortion of what Plato's really doing here. But what he's saying here is that this wisdom of the soul will bring us a certain joy and happiness and contentment. Okay, now here the idea of charm is coming in. Okay, in the first place, must it not be true that everything which possesses charm as its concomitant, that its most important element is either this charm in itself or some form of correctness, or thirdly, utility? For instance, meat and drink and nutriment in general have, as I say, for concomitant that charm which we should term pleasure. But as regards their correctness and utility, what we call the wholesomeness of each article administered is precisely the most correct element they contain. Okay, so meat and drink is a good example, very easy to look at here. So Doritos, for example, bring pleasure, but we wouldn't call it a good food because it is not healthy. We may not even call it a food, actually. That's debatable. But anyway, it's certainly not wholesome. And so its goodness would come from whether or not it has nutriments or not. Okay, so now that he's given us that simple example, we can go on to how we apply this to learning. Learning, too, is accompanied by the element of charm, which is pleasure. But that which produces its correctness and utility, its goodness and nobleness, is truth. So So it may be pleasure that gets us interested in doing philosophy and reading Plato and contemplating it, but it's truth that is what gives it its meaningfulness. So gossip, for example, may be pleasurable, but if it's not true and it's not meaningful, then it's just gossip. We can toss it away. It doesn't have that wholesomeness, if you will, that true learning has. All right, well then, how about the imitative arts then, which produce likenesses? If they succeed in their productions, should not any concomitant pleasure which results therefrom be most properly called charm? Yes, but speaking generally, the correctness of these things would be the result, not primarily of pleasure, but of equality in respect of both quality and quantity. Excellent, he says. So we're going to see here that the imitative arts, they can be a negative thing if we're imitating ignorant people from childhood on, but also we can imitate the beautiful or the wise, and it brings us a little, it may be at least a stage. It's not obviously the goal is to not imitate somebody else because you want to know that wisdom for yourself, but along the way we may find ourselves trying to imitate what is beautiful, and there are various ways that we can bring imitations to manifest them in our lives once we've experienced beauty, as we'll see in some future slides here. But what he's saying here again is that there's a certain pleasure that comes from that, but what you're really looking for is the quality and quantity of the imitation. Now let's apply that a little more. Then we shall rightly judge by the criterion of pleasure. What would you judge by just pleasure? Can you have something that's just fun? I mean, I think anyone who is doing Platonism has probably heard at some point, why does everything have to have meaning? Why can't it just be fun? Lighten up. Well, Plato does recognize things that can just be fun, and there is a time to rightly judge something just by pleasure. Here's what it is. He says, shall we rightly judge by the criterion of pleasure that object only which in its effects produces neither utility nor truth nor similarity nor yet harm, and which exists solely for the sake of the concomitant element of charm, which element will best be named pleasure whenever it is accompanied by none of the other qualities mentioned. And Clinias says, oh, you mean harmless pleasure. Yes, and I say that this same pleasure is also play, whenever the harm or good it does is negligible. So there is room for a Platonist to play and have harmless pleasure. Should we not then assert as a corollary that no imitation should be judged by the criterion of pleasure or of untrue opinion, nor indeed should any kind of equality be so judged? The reason why the equal is equal or the symmetrical symmetrical is not at all because a person opines or is charmed thereby, but most of all because of truth, and least of all for any other reason, most certainly. So we shouldn't make our laws based on what is fun, but we can have harmless pleasures in our life. But when it comes to those laws in our soul, we're judging by other means, by what is true. The reason why the equal is equal or the symmetrical is because of truth, not because of pleasure. All right, so whenever a person states that pleasure is the criterion of music, we shall decisively reject his statement, and we shall regard such music as the least important of all, if indeed any music is important, and prefer that which possesses similarity in its imitation of the beautiful. So all along on the surface story, this Athenian stranger has been talking about judging music contests, those choruses singing to the masses. That, of course, is not what I'm focusing on, and so it's easy to forget that that's what's going on here, but because I haven't given those quotes. But that is the surface story. And so now we see why that is the surface story, is because we're not judging music by pleasure. There are such things as harmless pleasures, but not music. Music is not one of them. What we want to be doing is developing that state of mind that is the wisest. And that would be the one that possesses similarity in its imitation of the beautiful. In the Dialogue Symposium, Plato gave us that whole ladder of beautiful things that lead up from beautiful bodies up through beautiful ideas and the sciences and so on, all the way up to beauty itself. The experience of reality itself, that peak experience, often called an enlightenment experience, is what he calls, that experience is beauty. He calls that beauty itself. And we want to carry, in the Republic, he tells us we want to carry the memory of that in our soul and act from that so that we are manifesting in the world our understanding, our wisdom about the beautiful, the just, and the good. And so all that we're doing is, all of our actions then, our state of mind is an imitation, ideally, of the beautiful. That's the goal that we're aiming for, is a philosopher king, so to speak. All right, thus those who are seeking the best singing in music must seek, as it appears, not that which is pleasant, but that which is correct. And the correctness of imitation consists, as we say, in the reproduction of the original in its own proper quantity and quality. So each realm in our metaphysics, as it unfolds, it has its own proper power, its own proper unity. So we're bringing beauty into the physical world at its own proper quantity and quality. Now, the person who is to judge a poem unerringly must know in each particular case the exact nature of the poem. For if he does not know its essence, what its intention is, and what the actual original which it represents, then he will hardly be able to decide how far it succeeds or fails in fulfilling its intention. So as Plato often does, he first gives some example, and then he's going to give a more general, his general point. So here he's using a poem as an example, that if you want to judge a poem, you have to first know the intention of the poet. Does the poet have wisdom? Is the poet looking to beauty itself and manifesting that beauty in the poem? And then, of course, you as a judge also have to have wisdom in order to know if you have to know beauty itself to know if this poem is indeed a good copy of that. So you have to know what the poem is an image of. Okay, now looking at it in a more general sense then, in regard then to every representation, whether in parenting or music or any other art, so he's calling parenting an art, by the way, must not the judicious critic possess these three requisites? First, a knowledge of the nature of the original. You have to know beauty itself. Next, a knowledge of the correctness of the copy. And thirdly, a knowledge of the excellence with which the copy is executed. And Clinias says, it would seem so certainly. It is absurd of the general crowd to imagine that they can fully understand what is harmonious or rhythmical, or the reverse, when they have been drilled to sing to the flute or step in time, and they fail to comprehend that in doing each of these things, they do them in ignorance. But the fact is that every tune which has its appropriate elements is correct, but incorrect if the elements are inappropriate. So stressing here the idea that being good by habit is not really what Plato means by being virtuous. This has come up in some other dialogues as well, but the difference between right opinion and knowledge is quite great for Plato. Although it is almost necessary for a poet to have a knowledge of harmony and rhythm, it is not necessary for him to know the third point also, namely whether the representation is noble or ignoble. But for our older singers, representing, of course, those who are wise, a knowledge of all these 3 points is necessary to enable them to determine what is first and what is second in order of nobility. Otherwise, none of them will ever succeed in attracting the young to virtue by his incantations. So again, the difference between right opinion and knowledge, quite great. This much I know, that no creature is ever born in possession of that reason or that amount of reason which properly belongs to it when fully developed. Consequently, every creature during the period when it is still lacking in its proper intelligence continues all in a frenzy, crying out wildly, and as soon as it can get on its feet, leaping wildly. Let us remember how we said that in this we have the origin of music and gymnastic. So he finally is mentioning gymnastic, although he's tying it in through all of this with this idea of this energy. It's necessary for developing states of mind. And so it's necessarily being drawn into music, although he didn't talk about it directly. Now, what we say at the beginning of this quote, by the way, is that Plato is challenging this idea that we want to return to our childhood innocence. That as if that's what wisdom is. Many people promote that idea as being what wisdom is to being like a child. And he's saying, no, there's a certain education that we need. We may have a right opinion as children, but we have to understand why certain things are good and certain things are bad. And so we need that training in the soul. In the dialogue Republic, he ends with a myth. Plato ends with a myth that has people choosing their new life. They're in the afterworld and they're choosing their next life. And some of them are coming from above and some are coming from below. And then they all choose their next life. And those people who choose poorly often come from the heavens, he says, because they were good by habit, not by philosophy. So if you have right opinions, it may get you into the heavens after you pass, but you need that education to choose well for your next life. So for Plato, it's not enough just to have right opinion. You need to have this education. And he ties it in with this idea of music and gymnastics. And he goes on to say that we may say then that the one half of the subject of choristry has now been disposed of. Shall we proceed at once to deal with the other half in whatever way seems best, or shall we leave it alone? What halves do you mean? How are you dividing the subject? He says, in our view, choristry as a whole is identical to education as a whole, and the part of this concerned with the voice consists of rhythms and harmonies. Yes, and the part concerned with bodily motion possesses in common with vocal motion rhythm, besides which it possesses gesture as its own peculiar attribute, just as tune is the peculiar attribute of vocal motion. So here the idea of gymnastics is tied in with this idea of bodily motion, the dancing part of music. So talking about it a little differently than he did in the Republic, but still tying the two together. And it sounds like he's going to go on to talk about gymnastics then. In book 3, he doesn't really, although he does go on with music. And we're going to see that when next week when I go on to book 3. So if you like what you saw, I do hope you'll give it a thumbs up. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. And as always, if you don't already subscribe, I do hope that you will think about doing so and maybe sharing with your friends. So anyway, I do hope that you will join me next week for book 3. Thank you very much.